1977, and for the first time, Formula One would consist of 17 races. A long season then, beginning in Argentina, in spite of the uncertain political and economic situation. Well, several important transfers had taken place at the end of the previous season. It was already known that Carlos Reutemann was to join Niki Lauda at Ferrari, and it also became apparent that Ronnie Peterson was going to Tyrrell because Jody Scheckter had surprised everyone by moving to a brand new team, Wolf. Well, at Brabham, John Watson replaced Reutemann, where his teammate was Carlos Pace. Clay Regazzoni had found refuge at the very last moment in the Ensign team. While still basking in the glory of the world title that he'd acquired just 3 months earlier in Japan, James Hunt took the first pole of this 28th Formula One season. Well, Watson beside him on the front row, whilst behind then, De Paye and Lauda, whose relations with Ferrari were no longer what they had been. During the warm-ups, the Lotus and Ligier teams had suffered from engine breakdowns and were not starting the season in the best conditions. Well, there was in fact only one Lotus at the start, driven by Mario Andretti. The Grand Prix got underway at 4 p.m. local time, and despite that, the track temperature was in excess of 50 degrees Celsius. Add to that the fact that this was the first race of the season. It meant that abandonments were going to be numerous. While in the front, James Hunt had seemed to have done the most difficult part, and then he came off the track after breaking his rear suspension. John Watson, who obviously thought he'd take over the flame, let down by his gearbox. Lauda has abandoned. Pace is held back by a cooling problem. And to sum up, everything plays into the incredible Jody Scheckter's hands on board the Wolf. Well, in its very first race, the team belonging to this Canadian of Austrian origins, a specialist in offshore petrol research platform construction, won the race. One of the biggest surprises in the history of Formula One. Two weeks later, and this is Interlagos. The weather still just as hot since the first Grand Prix. The Ferraris have now added the Fiat trademark to their flags, but the internal situation, well, it's tense. At Tyrrell, they're still trying to develop their famous six-wheeled car, Jackie Stewart, often there. The warm-ups were marked by Mario Andretti's terrible accident. The engine blew up and caught fire. Well, the American just had time to escape from his burning car. At Ferrari, they added a new rear spoiler, but only to Reutemann's car, a miracle solution that immediately allows the Argentinian to gain a second and a half. As a result, after the warm-ups, Reutemann is on the front row next to James Hunt, who had claimed pole once again, whilst Lauda has to be content with the 13th best time. Well, things are even worse for Scheckter, the winner of the first Grand Prix, who's only on 15th spot, whilst Emerson Fittipaldi, the local hero, 16th. Luckily for the Brazilian supporters, Carlos Pace is also there at the start and even manages to lead for the first 6 laps. Hunt then takes over and remains in the lead for 16 laps. Behind him, Reutemann, Mas, Andretti, Regazzoni and De Paye, all waiting to pounce. So all running smoothly for most, but no luck on this day for Jody Scheckter. Yes, Scheckter was to retire during the 12th lap when his engine failed. Turns into a wholesale slaughter when Andretti also retires during the 20th lap. In all, out of 22 cars at the start, only 7 finish. 15 abandonments then, 9 through accident. In the end, victory goes to Carlos Reutemann, who led for the last 18 laps. The Argentinian takes his first victory for Ferrari, where he's clearly the darling compared to Lauda, whose premature abandonment in the Japanese Grand Prix in 1976 had clearly unsettled the team. Nonetheless, Lauda did finish in third place, but 1 minute and 47 seconds behind his teammate. Hunt second, Fittipaldi a superb fourth, Gunnar Nielsen in a Lotus was fifth, and Renzo Zorzi in a Shadow snatches a point for sixth place. After the Grand Prix, everyone kept busy with the broken vehicles. And in South Africa, starting off with a great moment on boards of this Kalami circuit with Patrick Depailler and the six-wheeled Tyrrell. In the warm-ups, James Hunt took his third consecutive pole. He's ahead of Carlos Pace, Niki Lauda and Depailler. Well, immediately after the start, Lauda starts pushing very hard behind Hunt's McLaren, followed by Scheckter and Depailler, who are waiting for their chance. From the 7th to the 78 laps, the Ferrari gets in front, and that is the last we see of it. The race is marked by a terrible accident. Renzo Zorzi's Shadow is at a standstill on the track, its engine smoking. Two officials rush towards it, crossing the track from the other side, and tragedy strikes. The second official is struck by the second Shadow, which is accelerating hard, driven by the Welshman, Tom Price. Well, the official is killed instantly, as is Price, whose helmet is almost ripped off by the official's fire extinguisher. A nightmare scenario in which the Shadow continues in its trajectory and rams the Ligier driven by Jacques Lafitte, who's struck by the driver who's already dead. The 5th of March 1977 saw one of the most appalling accidents in the history of Formula One. Lauda won the race despite everything and described it as one of its greatest victories. Scheckter second in front of Depailler, Hunt, Mass and Watson. A few days later, and another shock for Formula One. Carlos Pace is killed in a plane crash. He was replaced at Long Beach by the German driver Hans Stuck. Jean-Pierre Jarier driving an ATS that was in fact a former Penske machine. So Stuck made his debut for Brabham, replacing Pace. A difficult start for him, and he only qualified in 16th place. Everything was going well for Lauda though, and continuing in the same vein as Kyalami, he took pole in front of Mario Andretti. The start chaotic, Reutemann pulling away, Hunt getting into Watson's Brabham. Further back, Brambilla remains on the grid. Well, after that eventful start, Scheckter, Andretti and Lauda all break away, Lafitte leading the field. Well, the race was marked by Scheckter's domination as he led for 76 of the 80 laps. but Andretti and Lauda never let the South African get away, showing that they could take advantage at any moment should the occasion arise. And so it was that poor old Scheckter was caught. His front tyre had a slow puncture and he just couldn't keep up the pace. The end of the race was full of suspense between these three men. The rest of the field's more than a minute behind. Well, 4 laps from the end, Scheckter blew out. Andretti and Lauda got past. This was Andretti's 3rd Grand Prix victory, but the most special for him on home ground. Back in Europe for the 5th race of the season, took place at Jarama in Spain. In the championship, the situation was as follows. Scheckter and Lauda were in the lead with 19 points, followed by Reutemann 6 points behind, and Andretti 8 down. Well, right from the first warm-ups, it was Andretti that showed that he was near untouchable. It was already clear that apart from the American driver's talent, he'd already won at Indianapolis in 1969. The secret of his success lay in his car, the Lotus 78. Well, the latter had introduced a new concept that was to revolutionize Formula One in the following years. It was known as a wing car. It actually used an inversed aeroplane wing principle to create not lift, but downdraft using an overturned wing profile. Well, the warm-ups were also marked by the drama for Niki Lauda, who suddenly felt a sharp pain in his back. In fact, he'd just re-broken one of the 2 ribs that he'd fractured in his accident at the Nürburgring the year before. On the Sunday morning, the Austrian had to pull out of the race, an event that could prove crucial in the championship. As a result, Andretti's declared adversary for the victory was no other than Jacques Laffite, who'd qualified superbly in 2nd place. Well, the Spaniard participating in this Grand Prix, Emilio Villota, managed to qualify in 2nd last place in a McLaren M23. Yes, the official team had in fact been testing the new M26, but weren't satisfied with Hunt's time, which was 7th best. As expected, the race was marked by Mario Andretti's domination. Out on his own throughout, Laffite and Reutemann tried to keep up, but can't rival him. Worse, the Frenchman had to return suddenly to the pits with a loose wheel rim. Laffite had to be content with finishing 7th, a lap behind Andretti. Well, the only thing to stop the depression overtaking the blue team was the best race lap produced by the JS7. Second consecutive victory then for Andretti, which tightened things up in the championship since 4 drivers were within just 4 points of each other. The Monaco Grand Prix taking place on the 22nd of May 1977. The six-wheeled Tyrrells perform well in the warm-ups. Let's get on board. Three main events marked the race. The first pole of John Watson's career, the debut for a young Italian, Riccardo Patrese, in a shadow, and the return of Jackie Ickx at Ensign. He was replacing Clay Regazzoni for this race, while he was competing at Indianapolis in the 500-mile event. Well, right at the start, Jody Scheckter bounded from second place on the grid to take the lead, which he hung on to until the end. Well, the Tyrrells, despite their good warm-ups, were unable to prove themselves in the race. Peterson abandoned in the 10th lap and De Pey in the 47th. Well, a few laps later, and it was Watson's turn to disappear, let down by his transmission. That left the way open for the two Ferraris to go after second and third places. Lauda in front of Reutemann. Mas, Andretti and Alan Jones in the shadow completed the list of drivers in the points. In the championship, incredible as it may seem, Scheckter had got away and now had a 7-point lead over Lauda, 9 over Reutemann and 10 over Andretti. Yes, the Wolf team just kept producing surprises. Well, the drivers had to shake themselves up to deal with the situation that no one could have foreseen in Belgium. On the circuit at Zolder, the Lotuses seemed to have returned to strength. That allowed Mario Andretti to take a legendary pole, the 4th in his career. Well, completing a lap in 1:24.64 at an average of 181.276 kilometers per hour, he left John Watson with a second-best time, 1.5 seconds behind. Well, further proof of the Lotus superiority, Gunnar Nielsen qualified in third place, 1.8 behind the leader. The time differences behind him were enormous, at 2.2, Hunt at 2.4, Lauda at 2.5. Well, it looked as though we were heading for a new demonstration from Andretti, in the same vein as the Spanish Grand Prix. But on this 5th of June 1977, one element upset the works, the weather. Well, it was pouring at the start and perhaps upset to have been surprised by Watson at the green light. Andretti was to commit one of the biggest errors of his career as he rushed to attack the Irishman. After just 2 kilometers of the race, the two drivers have to abandon after they collide. Well, on the skating rink at Zolder, it was then Scheckter who laid down the law. Behind Scheckter, Gunnar Nielsen, who'd been told by Colin Chapman to attack if ever anything happened to Andretti. Well, he kept up with the pace in front of Jochen Mass. He was giving his all. Well, the rain soon stopped and they all had to stop to put their slicks on. Scheckter chose that moment to spin. Nielsen didn't seize the chance immediately since he chose to go into the pits. That to change his tyres, a wise tactic which allowed him to pull back in front of one of his adversaries afterwards. While Jacques Laffite had to withdraw with engine problems, Nielsen soon only had Lauda in front of him, and the inevitable happened, 21 laps from the finish. Nielsen overtook the Ferrari and went to take his first and only Grand Prix victory. By finishing second, Lauda returned to just 1 point behind Scheckter in the championship. The Anderstorp circuit was the site of the Swedish Grand Prix. Two of the drivers wanted at least to produce the same results, Reutemann and Andretti. For the latter, it seemed to start all right when he once again took pole, outclassing his adversaries, even if the differences were not as great as in Belgium. Nielsen, despite basking in the glory of his victory, could only take 7th time on the grid. Laffite, well, he said he was worried. Said the tyres are getting very hot, a bit concerned about the race. The result of the warm-ups, Watson was on the front row, Stuck third. On the other hand, it was all going wrong at Ferrari. Their V12 was not suited to the circuit. Reutemann was only 12th at the end of the qualifiers, and Lauda 15th. Well, this was at the same time when the best driver in the fields, in the top team, could lose 10 places or more from 1 week to the next. It was very close. Well, everything was ready for a great race, even if Andretti was expected to win. He led for the first laps and started to build up a lead. At that point, Jacques Laffite was only in 11th place, just in front of Lauda. Well, this was a waiting race played by the Frenchman, who only had a single car to his name. The reason was Ligier had preferred to reserve all their material for the following Grand Prix, which was to take place in France. In front, Andretti continued his superior drive. Nielsen was in front of him, but not on the same lap. He only had Watson and Scheckter behind him, keeping up some faint hope. But Watson and Scheckter, well, they were to collide in the 30th lap, which released a few hungry appetites. And that is the moment when Laffite decided to show his colours. Catching and overtaking his adversaries one by one. You might have to pinch yourself to believe it, but 5 laps from the finish, Laffite was second, having overtaken Stuck, Reutemann, Mass, De Pier and James Hunt. Suddenly, 4 laps from the end, Andretti's Lotus disappeared into the pits for a short refuelling. It was either that or run out. And so the Ligier Matra found itself in the lead. Laffite didn't let up and won his first Grand Prix victory. An historic day for French motorsport, but no Marseillaise was played on the podium. The organisers had foreseen everything except a French victory. Oh, when they held up the P1 board, he says, I thought they'd made a mistake. But then I realised I could go on and win. I'm very pleased.
Ouais, je suis très content.
Well, proof of Laffite's unexpected victory with a few witnesses to it. The Swedish Grand Prix took place on the same day as the Le Mans 24-hour race, and only a handful of French journalists were present. Well, the pictures you've just seen really are a document. The director of the Blue Team, Guy Ligier, had not gone himself either. Too busy preparing for the French Grand Prix. Well, he learned the news in his car. That was the first time that an entirely French car, apart from the tyres, had won a Formula One Grand Prix, and Laffite became the 4th French driver after Maurice Trétignon, François Sévère and Jean-Pierre Beltoise to win a race in the World Championship. Well, the warm-ups were marked by a new pole for Andretti in front of Hunt, Nielsen and Watson. Jacques Laffite took a magnificent 5th best time, whilst Emerson Fittipaldi had to be content with last place on the grid. Quite something for a double world champion. Well, John Watson took the lead from the start and began to get away. Behind him were James Hunt and Mario Andretti. Lafitte was fourth in front of Nielsen, Lauda and Scheckter. Well, the stands on the circuit at Dijon-Prenois were packed. Almost 80 laps were on the programme. The scenario was to be the same as that in Sweden, except that this time Andretti was to be the beneficiary rather than the victim. While Jacques Lafitte made a mistake and had to concede 2 laps after a bump, which meant he had to return to the pits, Watson was still in the lead on the 78th lap, but in the 79th, despair for the Irishman. Handicapped by a fuel gauge problem and with a heavy heart, he had to let Mario Andretti pass in the last lap. Watson managed to hang on to his second place, but he was deeply disappointed. Hunt was third, Nielsen fourth, Lauda and Reutemann only fifth and sixth. A very eventful British Grand Prix for the 10th round of the 1977 World Championship. A young French driver, Patrick Tambay, was making his debut at the wheel of an Ensign Ford entered by Theodore Racing. Well, he qualified brilliantly in 16th position. The other beginner in this Grand Prix, none other than Gilles Villeneuve, who at the wheel of the old McLaren M23 managed the real feat of qualifying in 9th position. A great friendship installed itself between the two young drivers, who could see a lot of one another, both on and off the track. Well, this was also the official debut for the Renault F1s. It opened a new era in the world of car racing. Everybody knows that the original thing about this project was that the engine was boosted by a turbo compressor. Well, by virtue of an equivalent coefficient fixed at 2 by the International Sporting Commission and compared to a 3-litre atmospheric engine, the cylinder capacity of this engine was reduced to 1.5 litres, or more precisely, 1,420 cc's. As a result, in England, no one believed that the project could succeed. As well as this wager from Renault, Michelin were also present with a radical shell tyre, another premiere in Formula One. Nonetheless, Jean-Pierre Jabouet qualified in an encouraging 21st place, 1.7 seconds behind Hunt's pole. Well, the race was marked by a duel between Watson and Hunt, with Lauda as the referee. Well, for some, the Watson-Brabham Alfa Romeo package was even stronger than the Andretti Lotus Ford Cosworth. But although Andretti had already won 3 times during the season, the same could not be said of Watson, who was to fail yet again. Jean-Pierre Jabouet in the Renault, abandoned in the 17th lap with turbo failure. Only to be expected, perhaps. As for John Watson, well, he waited until the 61st lap to abandon, leaving James Hunt the pleasure of winning on home ground. And once the checkered flag was lowered, the crowd invaded Silverstone. The communion between Hunt and the crowd was complete. Very emotional it was too. The German Grand Prix on the 31st of July took place at Hockenheim. The drivers had won their arguments, and the great Nürburgring, scene of Lauda's accident in 1976, had finally been abandoned. Well, in the heat of summer, Hockenheim was a furnace, which was bound to make the engines suffer. It started as early as the warm-ups, with Jean-Pierre Jarier and his ATS. In the championship, the situation was as follows. Lauda, the most consistent, was in the lead with 39 points. Scheckter and Andretti had 32, Reutemann 28, and Hunt had to be taken into consideration with 22 points since his win at Silverstone. Well, the Englishman still had an outside chance of keeping his title. The result of the warm-ups was pole for Jody Scheckter, with Watson beside him. It was the 6th time in 11th Grand Prix that the Irishman and his Brabham had started on the front row. Behind them were Lauda and Hunt, the Tyrrells out of the picture. Note that, amazing as it might seem, Emerson Fittipaldi did not qualify for this German Grand Prix. Well, to begin with, Scheckter kept the advantage, holding on to that pole position. Watson and Lauda behind him. Sadly for Watson, he had to abandon in the 9th lap with engine failure. He really was the unlucky man of the season. Well, the race was marked by an amazing series of engine failures. Only 8 cars managed to finish. After Watson came Laffite, De Peye, Nielsen, Andretti and Peterson, all abandoned, officially for the same reason. Well, the man who managed to avoid any of the traps, Niki Lauda. The Austrian won for only the 2nd time in the season, but he was beginning to make his name in the championship. A year after escaping from death, he found victory once again in Germany. A symbolic victory, followed by Scheckter in 2nd place, Stuck 3rd on his home ground, Reutemann 4th, Vittorio Brambilla in his Surtees 5th, Tambay 6th, making his first point in just his 2nd Grand Prix. The Austrian Grand Prix took place on the 14th of August, and part of it was run on a wet track. Lauda was on his home ground and had a 10-point lead over Scheckter. Reutemann and Andretti had been marking time for the last few races, and it was urgent for them to catch up, or they were going to lose touch with the title race. But this was exactly the moment that Lauda chose to take his 2nd pole of the season after Long Beach. Hunt was at his side, Watson for once a long way behind, only 12th on the grid. Well, the young Tambay managed a superb 7th place. For all that, it was Andretti who had a field day. Having started 3rd, he managed to overtake Hunt and Lauda, one after the other, in the 1st lap to take the lead. In grisly conditions, the American managed to hang on to his lead for 11 laps. Eleven laps in front then, but Andretti's engine let him down once again, just as it had done in Germany. And just like Germany, several other drivers also had problems with their engines, including Laffite, Nielsen and Tambay. Scheckter had to abandon after coming off the track in the last quarter of the race. Well, at this point, with the track beginning to dry rapidly, it was James Hunt who was running away with the race. But the Englishman was also to be let down by his engine in the 44th of the 54 laps. There was then a great surprise when victory was taken by the Australian, Alan Jones. Well, having started in 14th place on the grid, the driver of the Shadow DN8 snatched victory before the eyes of all the favourites, and in particular in front of Niki Lauda, who had to be content with second place on his home track. Jones, Lauda in front of Stuck, Reutemann, Peterson and Mass. For the Dutch Grand Prix, apart from Alan Jones, the hero of Zeltweg, the whole Renault team was back after its baptism by fire at Silverstone. Well, the company had given Germany and Austria a miss in order to prepare better for this meeting, but their engine gave up the ghost in the open warm-ups. But they refused to be beaten and changed it. Started again with the yellow teapot, as the British were calling it. In the end, Jabouillet took 10th best time in the warm-ups, a remarkable performance that stupefied many observers. Well, Andretti took pole in front of an excellent Laffite. They were both surprised at the start by the devilish James Hunt, who came from third place. Andretti got second back from Laffite shortly afterwards, while Jabouillet found himself caught up in a superb duel with Jody Scheckter, who was second in the championship, don't forget. This marks one of the turning points in the championship. Andretti comes back level with James Hunt and seriously wanted to get back into the lead. Neither of them backed down and they collided. Hunt had to abandon, but Andretti did not and was able to start again. As a result, Laffite found himself in the lead in front of the two Ferraris and Andretti, who was lucky to come through unscathed. In the end, though, Andretti dropped out too in the 15th lap with engine failure. Lauda could have driven carefully to be sure of his second place and help his championship chances, but the Austrian was not like that, and he suddenly seemed to grow wings and overtake Laffite on the 22nd lap. Well, a great battle then ensued between the two men right up to the checkered flag. Laffite gave his all and refused to let the 1975 world champion get away. Several times it looked as though the Ligier would get past the Ferrari, but it was not to be. Laffite was not even driving his best car, but his reserve after an irreparable oil leak that had been discovered during the warm-ups. Well, the reserve Ligier did not, unfortunately, have the benefit of the wide front axle or the long wheelbase. At the finish, there was only 1.89 seconds in Lauda's favour. All the others were relegated to more than a lap behind. The first of whom was Jody Scheckter in third. Fittipaldi was fourth, Tambay fifth, in front of Reutemann, if you please. Lauda was only a few points now away from his second title, since he held a 21-point lead over Scheckter in the championship. The big news at the Italian Grand Prix was heard in the corridors. Although the news was not official, Lauda had told Enzo Ferrari on the evening of his Dutch victory that he would no longer be driving for him in 1978. Well, the Austrian's transfer to Brabham had already been negotiated. It doesn't take much to imagine the dreadful internal atmosphere in which Lauda had to compete in the most important race of the season for his employer. Well, a scare in the warm-ups for Patrick Tambay, who came off the track violently and overturned. There was nothing left of his ensign. Clay Regazzoni gave him his car for the race. Well, Hunt had taken pole in front of Reutemann, who, as it was well known, had a better engine than Lauda throughout the weekend. Well, note the excellent performance from Riccardo Patrese, who took sixth best time in the warm-ups. Whilst disappointment reigned at Renault, they've been hoping for better than 20th place on the grid for Jean-Pierre Jabouillet. Problems for some, but Scheckter led for the first 9 laps before Mario Andretti took over control. The same Mario Andretti had had an offer from Enzo Ferrari to drive the legendary red cars in 1978. An offer that he did not take up, preferring to remain loyal to Colin Chapman. Once again, there was a massacre amongst the engines. Watson, Lunga, Tambay, Jarier, Jabouillet, Scheckter, Depayet, Stuck, as well as Giacomelli, all had to abandon because of engine failure. For once, Andretti was spared and raced on to his 4th victory of the year. Lauda once again managed to avoid all the traps and came second, with Alan Jones on the bottom step of the podium. Proof, if ever there was one, that the Australians' win in Austria could not be just put down to luck. Andretti had the joy of winning the 2 Grand Prix that he really held dear in 1977. America, the West, and Italy. The man from Trieste had come full circle. Only 3 races remained, and Lauda only lacked 1 point to be officially crowned champion. Another internal drama had shaken Ferrari. When they learned that Lauda's successor was to be Gilles Villeneuve, Lauda persuaded his chief mechanic, Ermanno Cuoggi, to go with him to Brabham the following season. When Ferrari discovered that, he decided to sack the traitor in the middle of the warm-ups. Lauda was livid and only started in order to make the last point that was synonymous with the title. Well, James Hunt took his 6th pole of the season at Watkins Glen Circuit. Beside him, Hans Stuck, who produced his best qualifier and showed what he could do during the first 14 laps on a wet track. In the end, the German driver had a good second half to his season, whilst his teammate Watson had gradually faded as though his initial bad luck had sapped his strength. Stuck was eliminated when he came off the track, and James Hunt took control. The English driver held on until the end to pocket his 2nd victory of the season. He was in front of Andretti and Scheckter. Placed 4th, Lauda pocketed 3 points, which definitively crowned him champion. Without his accident at the Nürburgring in 1976, he could have won 3 consecutive titles, a feat no one had achieved since Fangio. Well, real proof that Lauda was the best driver of his generation, showing amazing efficiency and a computer for a brain, bearing out his nickname that he'd been given early on. In Canada, it was Gilles Villeneuve who made the headlines. The Canadian was Lauda's successor at Ferrari, where they intended to line up their 3 drivers for the second to last Grand Prix of the season. Well, things were different then, and a supplementary test session was even organised for the Wednesday before the race for Ferrari and Renault, who still had a lot to learn. While certain of the title, Lauda was torn between 2 courses, honouring his contract down to the last letter, or deciding not to run for the Ferrari team, in which he had been unhappy for some time. Well, convinced that the Scuderia would be unable to prepare 3 cars properly, Lauda decided on the Friday morning not to compete in the last 2 races of the season. More drama and an exit via the back door for the brand new world champion. Well, another striking thing, the Renault team didn't qualify. They immediately decided to withdraw from Japan in order to prepare better for their 1978 season. Once again, the track was wet for the start, which didn't stop Mario Andretti from bounding forward at the green light to keep the advantage of his pole. There were 80 laps on the programme, and up until about the 60th, Hunt kept up the pressure on the Lotus driver. Sadly for Hunt in his McLaren, he managed to collide with his teammate Jochen Mass. Jody Scheckter took his place behind Andretti. Gilles Villeneuve spun and came 12th, 4 laps behind the winner. A few laps later, and another classic played itself out. Andretti was let down by his engine just 3 laps from the finish. Maddening for the American, who could have taken his 5th victory. But the scene was set for the 1978 season, and the Lotus team, with Ronnie Peterson once again in their midst, promising to be formidable. Scheckter claimed victory and officially became Lauda's second in the championship. Not bad in the team's debut year. Well, the season ended in Japan and Mount Fuji. As was the case in 1976, James Hunt was in good form and 3 Japanese drivers took part in the race. Takahashi for Tyrrell, Hoshino and Takahama for the Kojima team, which wasn't without its problems. At Ligier, Lafitte had a teammate to support him for the first time, Jean-Pierre Jarier. Andretti took pole, but right from the start, nothing went right for the American, who was overtaken by almost everyone. Worse was to come for Andretti on the 3rd lap. He had to abandon after a violent collision with Lafitte, who managed nonetheless to continue. On the 8th lap, there was an ambulance on the track, and for good reason. Villeneuve and Peterson had collided. The Ferrari finished up on the other sides of the safety rail, where it knocked down about 10 spectators. An official and a spectator were killed instantly. Another difficult moment in a season that had more than its fair share of problems. Here we see Tambay's car on the sidelines. The Frenchman had made a blistering start in Formula One and was to go on to drive for McLaren the following season. Clay Regazzoni dropped out during the 45th lap with an oil flow problem. In the front though, James Hunt had no difficulty and went on to his 3rd victory of the season. The Englishman won in front of Reutemann and Depeye, who finished the year on a high. Jones, Lafitte and Patrese completed the list of drivers in the points. Lafitte was the lucky driver after the race. He had to give up during the last lap when he ran out of fuel just as he was coming back fast on Hunt. He finished 5th nonetheless. In the end, Lauda finished the season on 72 points in front of Scheckter with 55. The Austrian statistics are impressive because he only competed in 14 out of the 17 Grand Prix run that year. But in those 14 races, he made it onto the podium on 10 occasions, which obviously made the difference. Behind Scheckter, there were 3 drivers grouped within 7 points: Andretti, Reutemann and Hunt. Well, Laffite saying, not too disappointed because I enjoyed myself. And a slight problem with Andretti at the beginning. Well, he says a bit of a problem. In fact, someone hit me and I went round on the next lap. I saw him on his side and guessed that it had been him. He shouldn't have been going so fast. And the season finishing with rather a weird podium, since both Hunt and Reutemann had already left to catch their planes. It certainly had been a fantastic, very eventful season.
The country where the Formula 3000 season began and ended.